And we're live. Welcome, everyone. We're here with David Cow, one of the three peacemakers. And we have a special guest from Australia. Her name is Toni Hays. And David, would you take over?
Yes, today we're really excited today to have Toni Hays with us, who is actually Indigenous Aborigine from Australia, talking about climate change adaptation according to interwoven with Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous values and culture, and also Indigenous science. So take it away, Toni. You can introduce yourself and what you do, and we'll just have a very casual conversation.
Thank you, David. I'm Toni Hays from Kamilaroi Nation, and I grew up on Yolngu homelands in Nhulunbuy in the Northern Territory. I studied environmental science at Bond University, and I've been working developing climate adaptation plans at state government level in New Zealand. I guess one of my key things is trying to ensure that we weave Indigenous knowledge throughout traditional knowledge and ecological knowledge throughout climate adaptation, and bring that through into all of it, into the plans, because they're really important. I think we have to look at most vulnerable people in our community, and if our programs aren't reaching our most vulnerable, then they're not successful. So I think that's something that we have to consider when we develop plans. So, do you want to say something there, David?
No. Just continue, please.
I continue. Oh, goodness. Oh, no. So, adaptation, everyone is pretty much talking about mitigation. It's the in thing. You talk about adaptation, the main sort of focus I get is, I don't like that word, which I find really funny. So, climate adaptation, for me, being an Aboriginal person, really is what we do naturally anyway. And I don't just mean in the environment. So we have ranger programs, we have pest management programs. We know we have all of those ongoing. But it's also about what we do with our health and our education and all those social aspects as well, because they will all be impacted by climate change. So all of those things come into play, and we actually naturally have that social structure where we play and we come in and we talk and we combine and we have that all involved. Sorry, I'm getting a bit nervous. So, it's actually something we naturally do. What we do need to do, though, is be able to link in with governments. So when governments are developing their climate adaptation plans, that they're discussing those from the beginning, not just at that engagement stage. So it's about involving Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Indigenous peoples at that beginning stage. And then we can start to make sure by bringing in, we can bring in that local knowledge, that traditional knowledge, and it could be a more holistic plan, and that would ensure resilience. So Did you want to say something there, David?
Yes, please give an example of a project that you are involved with. So because adaptation is it's very broad. If you can give a couple examples of some adaptation projects that you're involved with, so the audience can have a clear sense of where this is leading.
Okay, so adaptation, it crosses many different areas, but I guess one of the key ones I do enjoy is biodiversity. So when we have biodiversity programs, it's about your pest management. It is about monitoring and putting in supports, and it's about bringing that knowledge that you have to help the environment. So these can be done on country, so on traditional homelands. They're already being done, but we do need to expand on those. And at the moment, they're being run just as a ranger program, whereas it needs to be more climate specific. And I don't even think I've read anywhere that they actually mention the climate. So, you know, we need to actually acknowledge that. And so, oh, goodness. And
maybe to go into a project example might be good, because, like, let's say examples, something for biodiversity, there was something that was a problem, and you produce an indigenous, with indigenous knowledge, you produce a solution. So just an example, so make viewers aware. Yeah,
that's what I was getting to. So I get a bit, sorry everybody, I get nervous. So it's actually more nerve-wracking being on the Zoomy thing than it is in real life. It's much easier in front of an audience. So yes, it's when you're looking at biodiversity, I think one of the key things we can look at with adaptation also is about persisting in your home or in your homelands, but it's even around your home, and then creating those corridors. So how we then link that into our neighbourhood, into our community, and then how we link that into a local national park or a national park, so that we can give our biodiversity areas to retreat. So if it gets too hot or too cold, they can move. And we need to be looking at these little things that actually become very important things. And we need to be doing that now to help, certainly to help our biodiversity. We see a lot of these programs already. We see them in the fisheries, as I said, we see them on country. But I think we also need to, everyday people in their homes need to be, you know, talking with our neighbours and talking with our community, and how we can be doing this. Yeah, I've jumped.
That's okay, Toni. We're here to guide you along the way, and also to, when you were young, did you always say, I wanted to go into climate change adaptation, or that was your dream, or what was
No.
what was?
No, I never considered going to university. It wasn't really an option. So I didn't do that till later in life. But I think having that prior experience, that knowledge in management and other fields, you can bring that in. That's why I love the climate. So you can work in health, you could be in child protection, you could have been in business, but in climate change, you bring all of that, and all that comes in into the focus, and it comes across in all your SDGs. So you can bring that knowledge with you, and it certainly does help to increase your output in your adaptation plans. I think one of the things is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and Indigenous peoples are most vulnerable because we live on country, or we live in lands that are most vulnerable, or because we have our hunting and gathering still in many places, way of life. So we are very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Our locations, normally can be quite remote, and like food costs, those sorts of things will come into play. So we need to be looking at, how do we help with these? How do we help our most vulnerable peoples? We were also in areas like in Northern Australia with cyclones, as they sort of come into play. Currently, if there's a cyclone, there is not enough cyclone proof accommodation or infrastructure. So, governments tend to fly in body bags. So if we're looking to the future, how do we fix this? How do we put infrastructure in to help the families in those places? How do we help the long grass people, which are like the wandering, the homeless people? So how do we put in plans that help them? So if our plans don't reach these parts of our communities, then our plans aren't right. And I think that's something we need to really think about when developing plans. We need to reach the most vulnerable people. Otherwise, it's, just kind of mainstream. We worry about mainstream and nothing else. It's not really hitting the mark. So we need to rethink what we're doing. Currently in Australia, we have what we call the gap, called Closing the Gap. They have a report. So what we see in that Closing the Gap is mainstream Australia with health, education, and then we see Indigenous Australia. And there's a gap as to where we sit and where we should be. Indigenous Australians are not as high as we should be. So we know, though, looking at climate change, that everything that's already looking poorly in that Closing the Gap will be increased and will be even more poor. So our plans, again, what if we're looking at Closing the Gap type programs, we need to be taking into account that we actually need to accelerate these. We accelerate the amount of money we're putting in, the amount of effort and planning we're putting in, and the outputs that we expect. They all have to be increased quickly. Otherwise, it's going to get to a point where it's going to be far worse than what it currently is. It's certainly not going to be better.
Also, Toni, we have seen huge forest fires in Australia, and they were saying that it was, I think, 1 million or 1 billion animals that were perished in a fire, including koalas and so on. You think this could have been prevented, or we could have sometimes people could have helped the situation to prevent that?
I'd say with where I come from, up in the Northern Territory, we have cultural burning, which is a cool burning. And that's done, around June, July, sort of in the year. So it's a cooler sort of months. The winds are not there, the storms. It's very quiet. It's quite a sort of feeling time in the environment. So if cultural burning had been implemented, it could definitely have reduced the impact of the fires. So it would take a lot of time, it would take a lot of money, but we have Indigenous peoples who are wanting jobs. We have people who are there with the skills. So when you've got the resources there, you just have to put the money and the programming in. Why not use them? It's also, it would definitely have reduced it. I'm quite sure. I wouldn't say it would stop it, because that's impossible, but it would definitely have reduced the impacts. I mean, they were absolutely catastrophic, weren't they? I only saw them on TV and I saw, those poor people. So yes, when you're looking at where I grew up, and the scrub, I guess, the trees, the shrubbery that you have around, and then you look at the cultural burning, I don't think we ever actually had a burn that wasn't a cultural burn. So it did help. There's no doubt about that. So yes, I think that the government should be putting in more resources and employment opportunities in that area. So
You
yes,
think, Toni, that as Aboriginal or Indigenous person working in Australia, are there prejudices or limitations or ceilings that is put upon you to in your field and in other areas?
Well, I think first of all, what I come across is, still that climate change. That's we've come across that as a bit of a block. And then yes, the Aboriginal, so that doesn't help in a lot of places. But once, look, I guess the first thing people say, well, what is it? Other than you've got tradition, what do you really bring? What can you do? And then once I actually start listing all the things that we currently do in climate adaptation and how we could expand on those, people actually start going, oh, I didn't realize that. And then they start to come on board. So, it's not just a wishy-washy sort of, a little bit that we're actually doing. Sorry, I'd also like to mention, I think that Aboriginal Australian people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have somewhere between 30 and 40% of Australia's, of the...
Oh, I think she disappeared. Maybe she has a feed problem. Okay, she's Alice.
Yes, she's not in this broadcast right now. She's
We'll wait for
trying
her to come back.
She's coming in.
Sorry, I just disappeared.
You're back.
So just looking at that, like we manage 30 to 40% of Australia, of the continent. And so to think that you can mitigate climate change without involving us is just bizarre. And to think that you can adapt to climate change and help biodiversity without our help is just bizarre. It can't be done. So, when you're looking at that, we are managing a large area, huge area. And we have many organisations and many peoples on the ground in those different programs doing that. I see from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, we're contributing with the corals and the fishes, through to range of programs on countries, it goes across the board, the adaptation programs that we're already doing, but they're just not called adaptation programs.
So are you saying that Australian general population are hiring Indigenous people for all these different adaptation programs across Australia?
No, they're mostly Indigenous organisations and some combined with state and federal government organisations. So not private, no. So we're doing that, and I don't think we sell it enough as actually how much we do contribute. So I think that's something that needs to be said more. And we need to be telling people this is what we are doing to help. We are helping through many of these programs through a large amount of country, and we are hoping, through government funding to increase that.
Right. Also, what is Aborigine or Indigenous people in Australia thinking about their sovereignty? Let's say, do they want to be part of Australia, or they usually want to have their own sovereignty or freedom?
That's not my area of expertise,
Right.
but I'm quite sure that, yes, definitely for sovereignty. But I think the main, yes, and that's not my area, so I'm adaptation. But
No, because
it is good to have a say through everything. That's right. And if we had sovereignty, we would have more involvement in programs that are being delivered, more involvement in the funding and the policy, and then we'd have better outcomes for our peoples.
Well, for adaptation, right? Right now, what are the main challenges for adaptation for Indigenous people in Australia and neighboring countries? What are the main challenges? Is it like food, migration?
Well, that would depend where you were in the country. So we know in Thursday Island there are some major water inundation problems. So, for them in that area, that would be their highest risk. They're most vulnerable to. Heat is another one across the northern of Australia. Water, droughts. So we had a really good rainfall. We've gone now into El Nino, and everyone's gone, oh, there's no such thing as climate change. So you sit back and you think it's the extremes of weather. So it's the extremes that we need to be telling people, not just, we get a bit of rain and we don't have to worry about it. So yes, those sorts of culturally, we need to look at our cultural infrastructure. So it's not, I class our stories and our songlines and our cultural sacred places, I call that infrastructure. So all of those have been, will be impacted. We need to look at that and what that means for us in our communities, and what changes may be needed to be made to that infrastructure. So, our songlines and our stories we will need to add to tell this story. It would also mean some of our sacred places, our water holes, are going to be impacted. What does that mean for us? How each community will have to look at that and consider that for themselves. But there's all those sorts of things. And one of the things we don't have in Australia, we don't have a climate change Indigenous come together. We don't have that knowledge sharing. We've got lots of individual peoples doing work, but there's no real coming together and sharing with that knowledge and making decisions. And you're talking about your sovereignty. We need that side of things in climate change to actually make real changes and to help our peoples.
I have also another question, is that, we have heard also Australian government approving a huge coal mining, and about that there was a lot of news about it. What are Aboriginals or Indigenous people's point of view on that? Are they doing anything about that?
I haven't been involved with that, so that is, and I know it's a very contentious issue. Look, we need to reduce the world needs to reduce its impacts. But it's like, I know when I was at university and I was taught about in Africa to stop the hunting, to stop the hunting of the wildlife, the poaching of wildlife. And they said, well, how do we stop that unless you put in another trade or you put in another way of making money? So unless you've got something to transfer it to, it does make it more difficult too. But look, many people are against SDGs, employment. There are many Indigenous people working in them. So, it's on Indigenous lands. Some people are getting royalties, some are not. I don't know. It's a very difficult issue. So, it's not really, it's just very difficult issue, and how you fix that, and governments on that.
Yes, it is a difficult issue because there is always economics or money versus the environment. So there is a challenge of a current economic system where we have to destroy the planet to make money. So that is a huge problem that has to be resolved.
Yeah. So until we come up with an alternative, I guess it's one of those difficult, especially right now. You see a lot of unemployed people. I'm not saying I'm for coal at all. I'm just saying that I can see the logistics of changing it over is actually very difficult, and high unemployment that's going to get worse. It's one of those situations. I think you had a chap on before though, and he was talking about the change to solar and wind, and I can't think of his name, from one of the universities, and that was actually one of the most enlightening conference chats that I've seen. So his viewpoint's definitely worth looking at. I just don't remember his name, but
Yetao, Yetao, Yetao.
Yeah, definitely worth looking at his, because it does give you a more broader look at the big picture of it all. It's not just easy saying get rid of this or get rid of that. There's a whole complex system that we have, but we want to change it. We want it better, and we want to improve things for our lives and our children. So but we need to do it, and we need to do it now. But yes, how do we go about doing that? It's very tricky.
So what would you like to see in a blueprint for Indigenous people for adaptation to climate change? Because we are, through this event, COM26V.com, a conference of the movements, our goal is to create a blueprint for the future of humanity in the different areas, all the way from climate to the clean water, to the oceans, to the forests, to the economy, to new social systems, and so on. So what would be your contribution or your idea to create that blueprint for climate adaptation that we need to put it in there? the blueprint?
I think it needs to be clearly explained what adaptation means to Indigenous people, what it's impacting. And because at the moment everyone automatically slots us straight into the environment area, but it's everything in our lives. It is our health, it is our housing, it is, you know, every aspect that will be impacted is our adaptation. So that needs to be clarified, and I think we need to educate people more on that. And then we need to be having more chats in the decision making at higher levels, right at the beginning, not just, you know, once the plans have been done and we kind of give an engagement somewhere down the line. It needs to be included somewhere way at the top, and then we can work through with that local knowledge and that traditional knowledge and bring that in. And then only, as I said, only then we can actually start to really have a resilient outcome. We need to look at what we can add. We need more money, really. The programs that are already running, there needs to be more money, and we need to expand on them. We need to look at what else we're going to need. Like I think when we looked at I can't remember it now, but the Closing the Gap, the money that's being put through for the government for that for Indigenous peoples was, you know, very, very minimal. When we look at what the Australian government is providing to the Pacific Islands in climate adaptation and education, and then you look at what they're providing to Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we've got, I think, it's like less than a quarter of the money. So, you know, I'm not saying take it away from the Pacific Islands. I'm just saying we need to increase our help to our peoples in Australia for our Indigenous peoples here. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's the money's not there. The infrastructure is not there. The policy and the talking with government's not there. You know, the decision making's not there. So we need to have a look at all of those things and improve those to involve more of our peoples in those decision making.
We live in a very funny world, Toni. If you say I'm going to have build pipelines or coal mining, they're going to have money for that. If I'm going to build weapons or tanks or missiles, they're going to have money for that. But when it comes to these issues, there's never enough money because they're going towards things that, well, climate adaptation, we're not going to make money from it, but we're going to make money from weapons or mining or other things, right? So that's a very strange world.
Especially in a recession, the government automatically throws money into infrastructure. That's the number one, the quick go-to. And the good side of that is a lot of that will actually be adaptation work. So if the government's getting money to, you know, improve roads or improve bridges from flooding, it'll be improving, you know, the communities that need through infrastructure. So yes, that's great. I know a few areas, water inundation, they're getting some infrastructure help and support through those monies. So, you know, that's there. But I think it's when you get to the social aspect, you're right. It's a bit wishy-washy. So how do they do that? How do they perform that? Or how do they package it to go throughout community to make it better? And I think in the, you know, history shows us, or even now, non-Indigenous organisations get the majority of the money. And I think it's just because they report better. I'm not sure. Maybe there's alliances there, they report better, or it's just but Indigenous organisations don't get anywhere near the amount as non-Indigenous to provide the services on, you know, for our peoples. So we have to really think about that. We have smart people. We have many people with degrees. We have many people with the qualifications to do these. We're not back 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. So, you know, I think that needs to be considered now. One of the things I also notice we get in science, you're a scientist or you're Indigenous. You know, there's never an Indigenous scientist. So I think we need to start saying, you know, actually there are Indigenous scientists, and there's quite a few of us out there in all our different areas of specialty. So I think one of the key things is we have to start acknowledging that. Through the government, we have to acknowledge that there are specialties and that people have the knowledge there, that we can run these organisations, that we can input these, that we have the knowledge there and the expertise. We've been doing it for years. So we need to look at, to consider that as well. It's a big, tricky decision, amount of thinking and putting it into place. But at the same time, we have a lot of it there. We just aren't funded enough to increase what we're already currently doing.
That's understandable. So, Alice, do you have any questions for Toni?
Yes. Thank you, Toni, for sharing. What do you have any parting words that you want to instill on all of us?
I think, I believe that it is time now, we need to come together to discuss climate adaptation throughout Australia and throughout the world. We see the governments have already acted on that. They've actually been really good. Most governments have actually been really good at working on adaptation. They just haven't been really good at involving Indigenous peoples. So we need to look at that and start fixing that, include us because we have that knowledge. It's not only ecological knowledge, but traditional knowledge that covers, every social aspect. And we need the finance to support that. It will only get worse for our peoples, especially if they're living on country, if we don't start to put the funding in there to fix these straight away.
Yeah, definitely coming from living in Canada. Now I'm living in the USA, but when I was living in Canada, it was a little bit strange because to manage the forest in Quebec, they had only white people to manage the forest, but there were no Indigenous people to manage the forest where they lived there. And they have where the Indigenous people just recently that had a moose moratorium. That means like no hunting for moose. And the Indigenous people were saying that the moose population was in a decline, a serious decline, and it could have faced extinction, the moose population. But the people who were counting the moose, they're using old data from hunters that were giving them the data, and they said, we saw a moose there, but that moose was like 5 years ago. They're using the data, and the Indigenous people were saying that we have a count, and our count is more accurate. And they said we don't want to hear about your count. Your count we don't want. So the situation was they were using the hunters that were shooting the moose were counting them, and then afterwards they said the Indigenous people, they don't take their counting is not accurate, and but they live there. They see the moose every day, and they know which moose lives in that territory. So the situation is that the reason why I believe they didn't want the Indigenous people to be part of the counting the moose is because it was economics, because they were charging a lot of money for license for hunting. So they receiving a lot of revenue from giving hunters a license to hunt. And that is the reason and the incentive for hunters to overstate the population is they don't want the hunting to stop. So they're in bed with each other, trying to help each other, and the Indigenous people are impacted by that. That's an example of being 100% excluded from the process, the scientific process of counting, simple like counting a moose. What is your perspective on that, Toni?
Oh, it's just madness, isn't it? What do? You just have to shake your head. But we have a similar thing. We have in Australia, I've noticed a lot of scientists go and they research Indigenous ways, Indigenous knowledge. So they'll go on country and they'll learn Indigenous knowledge, and then they'll go back and then they're Indigenous experts. So yeah, it's just madness. So and then we've actually got these non-Indigenous Indigenous experts who represent us at high government levels and international levels. So again, you're thinking, it just doesn't make sense, does it? So when again I bring into we also have Indigenous scientists. Wouldn't they be a double expert? So, but you can't. It's just very, very unusual how it seems to play out. And then we also have at the moment the government's brought in, and it's a good thing. It's brought in. It's just new. The government is starting to implement a voice for Indigenous peoples through programs. Now, I don't know how this will play out. I don't know how successful it will be. It's only new that I've seen. But I've noticed that they'll just grab any Aboriginal person that's got a degree to assess whatever program that is. So that might not be their specialty, but it's kind of like what we used to call a rubber stamp. So you've got, the black fella, he's come and he's looked at it and he's given it the go ahead. But what that does is puts us back decades, because you don't have the specialist in that area going through the documents or the report or whatever it might be from an Aboriginal perspective. So it'd be like me, going through a report on astrophysics or something, and I'll go, oh, yes, that relates really well to Aboriginal people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, don't know anything about it. It's not really my area, but we do have that, and that's coming through, and that's only through laziness of not finding the right person in the communities. So again, it's sort of being skewed all differently and very oddly.
Right. Example, the United Nations, right? They say Indigenous people protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. Yes. United Nations report, and that there's a serious decline in biodiversity, but there's no Indigenous representation at the United Nations level. They don't have any voice or votes, and they're excluded from meetings. They're all talking about biodiversity, but excluding the people who protect 80% of the biodiversity. Totally it's insane world,
Yep, that's right. And it comes from, local to state to federal, and then it goes international. This is exactly the same process. So we're being, written, and we've been acknowledged for it, and then we've written reports that are obtained, and then they're all sent through, and we're just shoved to the side. It's very odd, and I think maybe it might be time to call that out. I think it's time to say, okay, it's not good enough that non-Indigenous people are standing in our spaces. Really, it's not right. It's just ethically not right. I don't know how else to put that. It's just very odd.
I think it's all to do with the doctrine of discovery internationally by the Vatican when they first came to the Americas to conquer the different lands. And also in the US, we have their own version of doctrine of discovery called Manifest Destiny. So this is the same thing, that, if you're non-Christian, you don't have a soul, you don't count, you can steal your land, steal your resources, and it's still being used, I think, of that they have the right,
Yes, it's just we have Indigenous knowledge experts now that are doing it for us.
I met them before. I was kind of a little bit surprised when I looked at LinkedIn, and they said it's an Indigenous expert. You just Google, you just do a search through LinkedIn, which I use, And I was kind of surprised because I was looking for Indigenous people, and there was Indigenous experts. Like, what is an Indigenous expert? And they're not Indigenous, you know.
Yes.
So that's kind of like here,
And to make
weird.
that even funnier, you go to friend them and they look at you and they go, "Oh no, she's a real one." So they won't accept your friendship. She's a real Aboriginal person doing what we're doing. No.
Yeah, there was a situation like that. Like I was invited to a group of white people. I'm not prejudiced against anyone, no, in any way, but they were practicing sweat lodges and ceremonies. It was all white. I didn't know, you know. And when I went to talk to them, I said, "Oh, I know my friend is Mohawk. You know, like we're gonna I want to invite him into the circle." He said, "No, no, 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 no. We don't want any Indigenous people into here." I go like this. What? I said, "You're doing sweat lodges and Indigenous ceremonies and Indigenous drumming, and you don't want any Indigenous people into your group." I left right away afterwards because I thought it was very, very strange, you know.
Yes, and I've had similar things like working in government, and you're talking about engaging. Can we go and involve the community in our work? And it's quite often the heels go down and the heels go in. You're thinking, why are they stopping? What's going on? And then it's this belief that it's very difficult or something. And I'm just thinking, well, for starters, just hold a meeting. Really, let's just start there. And then we can go and build up from there. But I think people get afraid of it, but I don't understand why.
I think maybe you're too smart. You have too much knowledge. We scare them.
A scientist and Indigenous, yes.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, it is very funny practices that we do see, but all of these things halt at the success of what we do.
Right.
So every time this happens and we allow it to happen, it is keeping us down. It's keeping us back. It's stopping our progress. It's stopping that how well we could be achieving things. And it's just these little things like this, by not acknowledging the right people, putting the right people in those positions or in those voices to be heard. And it definitely it impacts us as a community.
Thank you so much for coming on with us, Toni. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and let's stay connected because you are holding a huge key to the solution to creating this global blueprint that we're co-creating together. So, Alice, do you have any last words you want to say to Toni before we sign off?
Thank you so much, Toni. It's been a pleasure hearing what you had to say, and we look forward to working with you another time.
Thank you both very much. Sorry, I get nervous.
I'm more nervous than you are.
But you don't look it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All.